Good afternoon. We're about to resume. Raise your hand if you're able to hear me clearly. All right, that's good enough. Lower the hands. Thank you. All right, this afternoon, we're still on introduction to EMS. Gonna do a short presentation on what it's like to be an EMS provider on a daily basis. So a day in the life of an EMS provider. We'll also be looking at the Jamaican EMS system to some extent. All right, the objectives of this presentation is to define what is an EMS system, list the providers that function within an EMS system, understand the type of care provided by EMS providers, understand what a typical day is like at work for an EMS provider, and we'll be looking at the challenges. What are the challenges of working in an EMS system in Jamaica? All right, so we're going to start things off with a story. Now, in EMS, the shifts are usually 12 hours, and it can be night, day, or graveyard, but it's usually 12 hours. In Jamaica, it depends on where you work. The private companies tend to go 12 and 24 hours. Industrial companies tend to go more with 8-hour shifts. Fire brigade is 8 hours. But generally, the shifts are 12-hour shift. In the States, some companies will, for paramedics specifically, it's 24 hours on and then 4 days off. So it's a 12-hour shift, night shift, 7 p.m. to 7 a.m. I got to work 30 minutes prior to the shift starting. So we have to get to work at least 30 minutes or 15 minutes prior to the shift starting so that we can check the unit, check the equipment, check the medications, stuff like that. So we check the ambulance, aka the rig or the box, and we say a little prayer. We pray to the EMS gods that they have mercy on us for this particular shift. At 7:05 p.m., first call comes in. It's a 62-year-old female found unconscious or unresponsive by her husband. So we drive out, lights and sirens, ensuring we do so with regard for public safety. We arrive on scene. We arrive on location safely and within 10 minutes. Our scene and patient assessment revealed a diabetic with low blood sugar and bad veins. This particular patient had terrible veins, and she also had signs that she had to be given an intraosseous access in the past. I usually see that with patients that have terrible veins. I am worried because the patient is unresponsive, blood sugar is low, patient needs to get sugar via the intravenous route. or within the veins, but I don't have a IV access route available. Management. Then I remembered I'm a well-trained paramedic, so I ensure that the patient has an airway, the chest is moving, and the heart is pumping. For this particular patient, I ended up giving glucagon IM to buy some time to search for a vein. Eventually found a vein. When I started to advance the IV catheter, I hit a valve. This was the only vein I could find at the time, so I didn't want to lose it. So when I made contact with the valve, I removed the needle and then attached a syringe with normal saline and used the syringe to flush the IV catheter while advancing the catheter. So basically I was using the flush to open the valve inside that vein or guide the IV catheter into the vein. So eventually establish access. I was able to give her dextrose or sugar through the vein, and the patient starts to wake up within 3 to 5 minutes. We then packaged the patient for transport, took her to the most appropriate healthcare facility, and handed her over in a stable condition to the medical staff. That was my first medical patient as a paramedic. I took the lead and I managed well. Now I clean my unit and restock, and I say to myself, bring on the calls. I am ready. Now, conclusion. I had 6 more emergency calls on that particular shift. Some did not end perfectly, but we learned to do and hope for the best by being disciplined and following protocols. Some people think we just do first aid, right? So a lot of people tend to think that all we're doing is first aid. Others think we operate a taxi service. We're just doing pick up and run. Some think we are race car drivers, and others think what we do makes us heroes. What we really do is provide emergency care to the sick and injured in the field. What is an EMS system? An emergency medical services system, also known as EMS, is much more than a ride to the hospital. It is a system of coordinated response and emergency medical care involving multiple people and agencies. These agencies are the hospitals. So we're focusing more on Jamaica. So within Jamaica, we have EMTs in the hospital setting. We have EMTs in the police force. We have EMTs in the fire service, the JDF, and private ambulance services in Jamaica. The response within an EMS system can either be basic life support or advanced life support. Currently in Jamaica, there is no advanced life support ambulance response available. So we don't have a established ALS response. However, in the industrial setting, so based on my observation, in the industrial setting, in the hospital setting, and I would also say in the JDF settings. So these are organizations in which it would be appropriate to utilize EMTs over EMTs, right? So I think in the hospital, EMT would be a better candidate to work in the hospital setting in Jamaica. I think EMTs would be better suited for industrial setting as well, and the JDF. Now, within the EMS system, as you learned previously, there are 4 levels of providers. You have EMRs, emergency medical responders, which provide field care prior to ambulance arrival. And within Jamaica, this can be firefighters, this can be police officers, and in the industrial setting, it can be safety personnel or persons who are a part of an emergency response team, right? So usually my recommendations for industrial organization is to go more with EMR training over EMT because it's a shorter course and you don't have to release the workers for 2 or 3 months, right? So you train them at the EMR level to provide appropriate assessment, life-sustaining care until ambulance response is available. And based on the performance of these personnel within the industrial setting, you can then handpick individuals that you think might be able to manage an EMT course. But I think EMR responder training is more suitable for persons within an emergency response team within an industrial setting. Now, EMTs, emergency medical technicians, trained to provide field emergency medical care and continuous care during transport on an ambulance, and it's specific to basic life support. AEMTs, advanced emergency medical technicians, trained to provide certain levels of advanced emergency care in the field and during ambulance transport. So they can do a certain amount of ALS skills that are specific to advanced airway management, IV access, limited medications. Now, the paramedics trained to provide all aspects of advanced emergency care in the field and during ambulance transport. Now, I mentioned previously that majority of the EMS responders that are currently in Jamaica are at the EMT level. We have a limited amount of AEMTs, I would say less than 20 AEMTs that I can think of off the top of my head that I have trained. And we have 3 paramedics. So there are 3 paramedics currently on the island. One of the persons is not a Jamaican. He's actually Canadian. He lives in Jamaica, but he works as a remote medic. He's married to a Jamaican. The other paramedic is in the Jamaica Fire Brigade, so that's the superintendent of EMS within the Jamaica Fire Brigade. And the third is myself. So I would be the third. The term paramedic is used very loosely in Jamaica, and it sometimes creates a bit of confusion, and it can be something that works out good for us or it can be something that works out bad for us depending on how we handle a particular situation, right? So, and my view will always be, you should never claim a qualification that you have not earned, right? So if it's not something that you have earned, you shouldn't claim it because it's going to look bad on the profession, right? And let's put things in perspective. So there's a emergency, there's an incident, right? And EMS personnel respond to that particular incident. The EMS persons that respond go on scene and say they are paramedics. They establish assessment and management of the patient. The management is poor. They transport the patient to the hospital. Patient is not transported under good condition. Then they hand over to the doctors, stating that they are paramedics. Now, some doctors or nurses will say it to you openly, or they will wait until you leave. But what would happen in that situation? This is what would happen. Doctor would say, you know, say one such and such a service bring in a patient. The two paramedics came with a patient. Patient wasn't properly assessed or managed. Patient in terrible condition. No. Um, these are paramedics. If these are paramedics, the training don't make sense. That's what the doctor is going to say. That's what the nurses are going to say as well, right? If these are paramedics, they're not properly trained if them do this. So you're claiming a title that you have not earned, and it can work the other way. So you go on a call, or EMTs respond to a call. They do a great job. Assess the patients, right? Assess the patient, provide appropriate management, package the patient, transport the patient, hand over to the doctors or nurses, and they're very professional, right? But they're saying that they're paramedics. Again, the doctors might say it openly, or the nurses might say it openly, or they might wait until you're gone. And then they talk amongst themselves. They're going to say, the patient that came in 15 minutes ago, a paramedic team brought in the patient. The patient was in great condition, right? They did an excellent job, man. Good thing we have a lot of paramedics in Jamaica. So the paramedic is getting the recognition at that point when it was actually an EMT that cared for that patient, right? So it doesn't work out. Don't claim titles that you have not earned. And a title doesn't mean anything. It means absolutely nothing, right? And a lot of persons get caught up on status and titles, right? There are some persons you dare not address them without their title. Don't you dare call me so and so, put doctor in front of that, right? It's not important. Your status is not important. Any level that you're at, once you do your job properly, you'll get the recognition that you deserve. So you let your work speak for you. Don't go out there and claim titles that you have not earned. It's not important. What is important is the level of care that is provided to the patient and the patient outcome. That is what is important. The most common level of EMS providers in Jamaica are EMTs. EMTs primarily function on a BLS unit. So primarily it is BLS. However, in certain areas, and this is outside of Jamaica now. Certain areas in the States, due to shortage, they might have an EMT working with a paramedic on an ALS ambulance. So AEMTs and paramedics primarily, or will always be on an ALS unit. And if it's a critical care unit, it's going to be a paramedic with critical care transport training, or it will be a paramedic with a nursing degree, or it will be a critical care paramedic with a doctor. So critical care units can have paramedics that are nurses or have done critical transport training, can have nurses, and they can have doctors. In Jamaica, the closest thing to Medivac would be provided by the Jamaica Defense Force, JDF. Now, emergency care. The level of care provided includes, but it is not limited to. So, airway management. EMS providers are experts when it comes to managing a patient's airway. Exceptional, right? So it's a skill that you must be able to do in your sleep, right? You need to develop that in your muscle memory. Airway management, it's one of the most important assessment and management you can do for any patient that is critical. If you don't have an airway, nothing else matters for a patient. Bleeding and shock management. Splinting. And that splinting can be the use of spine board. So it can be full body stabilization or limb stabilization. And full body would be spinal motion restrictions. Medication administration. Field management of critical trauma and medical patients. All right, now a typical day at work for an EMS provider. It involves time management, very important. Must be able to manage your time effectively. It requires waiting and preparation. So you need to ensure that your unit is ready, your equipment is good to go, and mentally you're prepared for anything. It involves responding to an emergency. So when the calls come in, we go out. When we go out, we assess, we treat, we package, we transport. When we transport the patient to the hospital, we hand over to someone at a higher level of training, right? So you cannot hand over your patient to somebody below your level of training. That would be considered negligence. So the person must be at your level or higher. And when we're handing over the patient, we have to give a verbal report. So you give a verbal report, and then you let them read your report and they sign the report. So proper documentation is a must. If it wasn't documented, then it wasn't done. Do not make up findings. So don't make up findings. If you didn't do something for your patient, you just didn't do it. Do not make up numbers. Now, challenges in EMS in Jamaica. We touched on this previously, where we stated that public awareness and education is lacking. Now, EMS in Jamaica started because a tourist died. So that's how EMS started in Jamaica. On the western end of the island, a tourist was involved in a, I can't remember, the water bike thing. I don't remember the right name for it. But the person died. EMS response was not available, and a lot of fingers started to point on who should be held accountable. And that's when they started to scramble to get EMS implemented. The first set of EMTs in Jamaica were trained in the fire brigade. Who is this person? Anyway, we're trained in the fire brigade. Right? That's where the first set of EMTs, and this was around 1994, 1995, somewhere within that time frame. And the pioneer for EMS response in terms of training in Jamaica is Dr. Winsome Sigree, Dr. Sigree. Right? This is one of my mentor, and this is a person that gave me the opportunity to become an EMT, and she's someone who has heavily influenced the way I teach EMS as well. But she's a pioneer, and she became a part of EMS because it was something personal for her. Her daughter was attacked and her throat was cut. I think it occurred in Cayman, and an EMT by the name of Roger saved her daughter's life. And from that experience, she dedicated a good portion of her life to training EMTs in Jamaica to be as good as the one that saved her daughter's life. So Dr. Sigree is the pioneer of EMS training in Jamaica. Right? Now, once they established an EMS response within the fire, because that's where the first set of EMTs were trained, when it just started out, it was doing quite well, right? Dr. Sigree had written protocols for them to respond with, but it went the path of everything that is established in Jamaica, right? So when the government establish things in Jamaica, there are no measures put in place to maintain what has been established, right? Now, from the training that took place with the fire brigade, eventually private training started, and organizations, industrial settings started to come on board to get training. Places like Jamalco, Red Stripe, right? And other industrial companies. Eventually got on board as well. Excuse me. Give me a sec. Just a minute. Right? And so it started out well, but over time it started to decline. And the reason for that was, as I stated, things were not put in place to maintain what was implemented, and what was implemented was not being regulated. So there were no steps to get EMS regulated properly. And over the years, it declined. And it's funny because when Dr. Sigree did her thesis for her master's, she looked at the future of EMS in Jamaica and what needed to be done to sustain it. But after 20 years, we still don't have a proper structure that's regulated. Now, with the introduction of social media and persons capturing response that are questionable, persons have become more aware, and not only that, there are other things at play. What do I mean by that? Well, the leading cause of death in Jamaica is as a result of NCDs, non-communicable diseases, and injuries. That's the leading causes of death. And the most common non-communicable diseases are cardiovascular emergencies, emergencies involving cancer patients, diabetic patients, and patients with respiratory problems. So these four non-communicable diseases are the primary ones causing most deaths in Jamaica. And on the injury side, the injuries are from violence, road traffic, accidents, and suicide. And the government of Jamaica spends $12.6 billion annually to provide care for a patient involved in road traffic accidents. Right? 12.6 billion. Now, with that type of statistics and the sustainable development goals, the government has to try and put things in place to reduce that, right? And one of the ways in which to reduce that, you're gonna be looking at your prevention measures. Always have to think about prevention. What type of measures are in place in case the prevention measures don't work? So when the motor vehicle accident do occur, how is this patient getting from point A, which is the accident scene, to point B, which is the most appropriate hospital? Is it civilians carrying these persons? Is it taxis? Is it private ambulances? Is it the EMS responders within the JFB, right? So that needs to be addressed, because that's where we're losing patients, and that's where we're getting patients with serious long-term disabilities because of how they were removed from that scene, right? So it's something that the government is starting to say, okay, we probably need to address this. And what has recently occurred is that the Ministry of Health has employed a doctor, Dr. Campbell. She's acting as the EMS director for the Ministry of Health. So she provides some level of oversight for the JFB response, right? And EMTs that function under the Ministry of Health umbrella. And her role is to develop policies. So that's her task. So she's working on policies and appropriate regulations. Now, for the private companies, once policies and regulations are in place, the private companies will have to adapt to that as well. The JFB system is a little different. So not the JFB, the JDF. The JDF system, it operates more like a hospital than EMS Response. I mean, they have ambulance, but the persons that work in the medical area, in the JDF, they function more like advanced responders than the EMTs. And I guess that has to do with the medical assistant training, right? So their structure is a little bit different than the common EMS structure. It's also a little bit different in the industrial setting, because in the industrial setting, it's occupational health. And occupational health combines several parameters. So you're looking at health and well-being of the employees. You have to monitor illnesses. You have to schedule medicals for employees. And then you have the EMS response component. If something happens on the plant or the terminal, then you must have EMS response available. And that response can come from a EMS response team, right? So the company has persons trained to provide on-scene care, and they have an ambulance available, or they have a private ambulance on standby. So their structure is a little bit different, right? So the public need to be aware of what is available. And we have 14 parishes in Jamaica. Kingston and St. Andrew is the capital. And Kingston doesn't have a government response, right? So Kingston does not have a government response. If you require an ambulance in Kingston, you're gonna have to pay out of your pocket for a private ambulance. And I am not a fan of private ambulance response in Jamaica, right? Because I don't think that's the solution to the current problems that we're having where EMS concerned. If we're paying taxes, so if you're paying tax as a Jamaican, you are entitled to pre-hospital care, right? So if you're paying tax, why are you going to take money out of your pocket and pay for a private ambulance? You're paying for something 2 times, and you might not get the quality service that you deserve. So that's ridiculous to me, right? That can't be the solution. So the long-term solution cannot be private response. And we're starting to see a lot of private companies popping up all over the island. And the more of these companies we see popping up, is the greater the need to regulate these services, right? And currently there's no regulation. I can buy a bus, put ambulance on it, and if I have a link in the Ministry of Health, I can get it passed, right? So that can be the long-term solution. The fire brigade, and I'm not saying this because I was a firefighter, the fire brigade already has a structure, emergency response structure in place. They already have a dispatch type system. So it would be appropriate to tie the government response to the JFB, but it needs to be right across the island. And right now, it is grossly limited. The JDF response is more specific to the JDF personnel. They do respond to situations depending on vicinity, but their response is more specific to the JDF personnel. Now, based on my years of teaching and interacting with students, and even working with some of these students, right now, I would say if I was in an emergency situation where I needed EMS response, the JDF would be the personnels that I want, right? In terms of what I've observed with their structure. The Jamaica Fire Brigade used to be the benchmark for what EMS supposed to be in Jamaica, but over the years that has declined for whatever reason, whether it's poor leadership, no lack of finances to maintain or upgrade the system, consistency to keep their providers at a level where they are up to date, but it has declined. So there are inconsistencies. I'm not saying that I wouldn't want firefighters responding, but it would depend on who these persons are. But I feel more comfortable with the JDF guys, depending on what I've seen. No, and I kind of cover that. Lack of proper government regulations and a clearly defined scope of practice. So the scope of practice is very confusing right now. And the truth is we don't really have a scope of practice. But right now, it depends on where you work as an EMT. So if you're in the JDF, you might be doing IV access, giving fluids, medication, ECG. If you're in certain industrial setting, you might be doing ECG, medication administration. You might be allowed to do IV and give fluids. These are EMTs. If you're working in the hospital, the EMTs in the hospital setting are doing ECG, IV access, fluid resuscitation, suturing, depending on the hospital that they work. So there's a lot of inconsistencies. And as I said earlier, when we covered chapter 1, if you are operating as an EMT, you should not be performing any skill that is outside your scope of practice. And my opinion is, if you are going to allow the EMTs to do IV, give fluid, medication, ECG, then let that EMT train up to the AEMT level where they are certified to do that, right? That's just my opinion on that, and I think that makes a lot of sense to me, right? So if you're going to expect them to be doing that type of treatment, then encourage those EMTs or facilitate those EMTs to become advanced EMTs. All right, so currently, no regulated ALS service to utilize AEMTs and paramedics. But based on certain areas, they are using these skills, but it's not regulated. There was a service that was doing ALS illegally. Can't remember the name of the service. It was in Ochi, Sentan, Crooks. I don't remember the name of his ambulance, but he was doing ALS stuff, but that was illegal, right? That was illegal. Now, underutilization and appreciation due to the length of time EMS providers are trained for. So one of the big issues in Jamaica, which is kind of ridiculous to me, is the medical fraternity tend to say EMTs don't train long enough to be doing this, or they shouldn't be doing that. And I think it's nonsense. An EMT is a specialized area. So it's a specialized medical area where you're trained to do specific things, right? Based on your assessment of a patient in the field. Now, the length of time that it takes me to teach an EMT how to open an airway and put in an airway adjunct is the same length of time it takes a med student or a nursing student. Well, if it's a nursing student, I would say a nurse doing ER training, right? It's the same length of time. There's no difference. And the EMTs do it more often in training because it's constant repetition. When they go out there, they tend to perform at a higher level because there's more repetition, right? In med school, you probably see an airway adjunct two times. So that notion where persons are not trained long enough, it just doesn't make any sense to me. And I always say to persons when they say that, it's because of two things, right? So if someone says that they have never been in an EMT course, and if they are overseas, they're not going to say that about an EMT that's treating them, right? So if out here you're not comfortable with an EMT length of training, then in the States or other places in the world, you shouldn't be comfortable either, because they are trained over a shorter time frame. So the length of training it shouldn't be a reason, right? What I think is a sensible reason is the lack of regulations. That is a good reason. The lack of regulations, the lack of protocols, the lack of medical direction, no laws to govern operation. If you don't have that, then you have inconsistency. And if there's inconsistency in how persons are delivering care, then you can have confidence in those providers, but it can't be the length of training. Right? So these are the current challenges in EMS in Jamaica. Are we making progress? I've seen a little. What I've observed is that over the last couple of years, a lot of persons are gravitating towards EMS training for whatever reason, but we can't just constantly be training persons and they're not properly regulated. So if we're going to be training EMTs to utilize them in certain areas, then we need to regulate what they're doing. And hopefully, within the next 5 years, we see some progress in that area. All right, now in summary, EMS is essential to pre-hospital field care, absolutely essential. There are BLS and ALS providers within an EMS system. A day in the life of an EMS provider is very dynamic, and I think that's what's the best about it. You're never quite sure what it is that you're gonna get, right? And that makes the job very exciting, and it makes it memorable. Sometimes we have good experiences, sometimes we have bad experiences. We can't save everybody. And there will always be calls that we can't forget. But in Jamaica, there are major challenges that exist in EMS. Major challenges. Clearly defined scope of practice, the underutilization of proper medical direction, whether it's offline or online, and laws that regulates the practice. And that would be the end of this presentation. Are there any questions?